It looks like someone has a brand new time trial position for 2024 and a new bike. Wout van Aert, one of the greatest cyclists in the world right now, has made some significant changes to his aero position. So we're going to take a look at both that and what looks to be the next generation Cervelo P5 he and his team debuted recently at the Tour of Algarve. Let's have some fun. Hi everybody, Jim from Faster Fiction presented by Aero Sports here today, and we're going to conduct our first position analysis of the year. And we're going to do a lot of these in 2024, some of pro triathletes, some of pro cyclists, and some of you. But we'll get into more of that later. Today, we have Wout van Aert. If you don't know who he is, well, he's one of the greatest cyclists in the world today. And he's a great all-around cyclist, though primarily has been known as a sprinter. But he's also an incredible classics racer, a super domestique, and a cyclocross phenom. He's also a very good time trialist, and it's his position for that particular event that we're looking at today because it's an all-new position for him in 2024. It's also a great example of how cyclists are restricted by and take advantage of the rules and regulations set forth by the UCI, which is the governing body of cycling. Wout debuted his new position at the Tour of Algarve last week, and of course, what got everybody's attention is that he and the rest of his teammates at that race look to be on and has yet to be released new Cervelo P5. Maybe it'll be the P6, but given the subtle changes we're seeing, I'm guessing it's still going to be called the P5. So let's take a good look at both his new position and that new bike and see what we can learn. Now, under the rules of the UCI, your position on a time trial bike is dictated significantly by your height. There are actually 3 height categories, designated 1, 2, and 3. Okay, each has its own restrictions. Wout van Aert is somewhere in the neighborhood of 190 centimeters tall, or slightly above, which is very important because that puts him in the 3rd height category, allowing the most amount of reach to his aero bar and also the most amount of height difference between the top of his aero bar extensions and his arm pads. In case you didn't know, here's a quick look at the 3 categories. Category 1 is for athletes, male or female, who are under 180 centimeters tall. That's 5'9" for those of us who are still using the imperial system of measurement. So under this category, the furthest point your extensions can be from the center of the bottom bracket is 800 millimeters or 80 centimeters. And the highest the top of your extensions can be above the center of your arm pad is 10 centimeters. Now, category 2 is for athletes 180 centimeters to 189 centimeters tall. So that's 5'9" to 6'2". And if you're in this category, your extensions are allowed to go out a little further to 830 millimeters or 83 centimeters. And the top of your extensions can be 12 centimeters above the center of your arm pad instead of 10. And then lastly, we have category 3, and this is for athletes at 190 centimeters or above. These athletes can have their extensions out to 85 centimeters or 850 millimeters from the bottom bracket, and the top of their extensions can be as much as 14 centimeters above the center of the arm pad. And this is the category that Wout is in, and we'll see how he takes advantage of those rules in just a moment. But first, let's look at some of Wout's biomechanical numbers in his new time trial position. Okay, so we just happen to have this beautiful shot of Wout from the side. It's not perfectly from the side, but it is pretty darn close, so we should be able to get some pretty decent measurements here. They might be slightly off, or we're not trying to be perfect, but we're trying to get a really good look at what this new position is. This photo was taken right at the top of this pedal stroke on the drive side, and it's a huge benefit anytime we get a shot like this when the crank is at the top or at the bottom of the pedal stroke. So let's take a look at the 2 measurements right off the bat. The first being his knee flexion angle. That's the angle or bend in your knee at the top of your pedal stroke, the point of most flexion, and the most acute angle of your knee throughout the pedal stroke. It's actually a much more important number than people realize. Wout is right at 67 degrees here. That's slightly closed off, and if you're a triathlete, that's probably a little more closed off than we want, but pretty darn good for a Wout. This particular angle people don't realize is what truly drives crank length. People think of crank length in terms of hip angle, and hip angle is certainly very important when it comes to crank length. Don't get me wrong. However, what actually drives crank length is your knee angle at the top of your pedal stroke. If that knee is too closed off, the power phase of your pedal stroke is delayed and you will lose overall power. But 67 degrees is pretty good for Wout. Now, for triathletes, we're looking to keep you at 68 degrees or higher. Let's also look at his closed hip angle. Again, right at the top of your pedal stroke, this is the most closed or acute hip angle throughout the pedal stroke, and it's also an important number for power production. We're right around 45 degrees, and that's pretty common for a World Tour cyclist to be right around that number, sometimes even a little more closed off, or sometimes even a lot more closed off than that. If you're a triathlete, though, we're typically not going to close you off that much, even though 45 degrees technically is at the bottom of our range for tri-fits. Normally, I'm going to keep you at 48 degrees or above because you have to run off the bike, and we need your hips to be ready for that effort. For time trialists, they don't have to run off the bike. They literally just get to collapse into the arms of a masseuse after crossing the finish line. They are at 45 degrees quite often, and that's a good number. The other thing we get really good look at here is his reach to the aero bar. That is his shoulder angle in the aero position, and we're looking right around 90 degrees here. Reach, of course, is limited by the UCI rules, which we're going to go into a little more here in a second. Basically, for you triathletes, you want as much reach as you can comfortably handle. And what people don't realize is more reach usually equals more comfort. Everybody has this idea that your upper arm should be perpendicular or pointed straight down at the ground, and that is just simply not true. It really never has been true. It's just sort of this myth that's been propagated by the internet, and then a couple of triathletes actually did well in that position, but it's never been the most comfortable nor the most aero. Look, you want reach, and more reach, the most you can handle. In this case, we have 90 degrees because that's the most he can achieve under the restrictions of the UCI. He's just not able to have more reach. Looking at knee extension, we obviously can't see the leg on the non-drive side, but he is right at the bottom of his pedal stroke, really slightly past the absolute bottom of his pedal stroke, but we can sort of get a decent guess of his knee angle on that non-drive side, and it's right around 136 degrees. What's interesting about that is it's actually, that would be low for most of the people watching this video. Based on history, most of you have far more extension of your leg at the bottom of your pedal stroke than Wout here. However, for an elite World Tour cyclist, this is a very, very common number, 136 degrees. If you want the complementary number, by the way, that's 44 degrees. And that is what you yourself should be striving for. Not that particular angle necessarily, but most of you are sitting at far more extension and your saddle's higher. And what you should be doing is having less extension. Now, this has changed pretty significantly over the last 20 years or more. Certainly, saddles used to be higher. But one of the reasons pro cyclists are now putting out more power than they ever have is just simply better knowledge of biomechanics. And what we found is that more power is being produced at lower saddle heights. And one of the main reasons we're actually doing these position analysis videos is to allow you to compare yourself to what elite cyclists and triathletes do. And perhaps you might realize, wow, my saddle is much higher. My knee extension is far greater than that. Maybe, just maybe, I need to change that and lower my saddle. So yeah, 136 degrees, which, by the way, is the knee angle several of the last world time trial champions have been at, all right? So there you go. Looking at his back angle, that's probably 15, 16 degrees parallel from the ground, and that is pretty darn aggressive, but not overly aggressive. Gone are the days of being just really crazy low. We now understand that you can be too low in front, and if you're exposing your back to the wind or you're not allowing your head to drop between your shoulders because you're just too low, or you've closed off your hip angle because you're too low. I mean, there's any number of things that being too low can do to you. And it can be less aerodynamic, less powerful, and just not as good. So 15 to 16 degrees, that's fairly common these days for a world tour level athlete. Again, probably more aggressive than we would want any triathlete. Most triathletes are going to be sitting up higher, closer to 20 to 25 degrees of back angle, or sort of in that area. And of course, with that back angle, we would be adding reach for you because you're not restricted by those regulations as he is. 4.5 position. Now we have to be aware that this is a picture taken during a race, right? We don't know how much he moves around on his saddle, but in this photo, he's in a pretty far forward position, right around 84 degrees. That we measure this by where the greater trochanter is or the center of his hip in relation to the bottom bracket. At 84 degrees, that's pretty darn steep. Most triathletes that you see today are riding somewhere between 80 to 85 degrees. So Wout here is pretty far forward and on his bike, and it really allows him to just kind of crush down on those pedals and put out as much power as he can. But again, I have no way of knowing if this is where he always rides on that saddle. Many time trialists move around quite a bit on their saddles. They're putting out so much power that they just don't always stay in the same position. In fact, you'll see them move around on their saddles, quite a bit in the aero position. That's just the way it is. Okay, so let's look at how Wout uses the rules to his advantage. As was stated earlier, due to his height, his extensions are allowed to be out as far as 85 centimeters from the bottom bracket. And it does look like that's about where he's at here. He might be slightly short of that. There's a reason, but my guess is he's right around that 85 centimeter mark. And remember, it's not the center of the extension they're measuring. They're measuring to the furthest point of that extension. So my guess is he's right around 85 centimeters. And usually what we're going to do is shorten that by a couple millimeters just to make sure we pass inspection at the start line. So my guess is probably 84.5 to 84.7 centimeters. Now he's allowed 14 centimeters between the very top or highest part of that extension to the center of his arm pad. And that's the center of the arm pad without the pad being on the armrest itself because, hey, we used to cheat that by using super cushy pads and that would collapse under his weight to give us more arm angle. But they got wise to that, so now they measure to the base of the armrest without the pad. He's allowed 14 centimeters, and he is taking every bit of those 14 centimeters because you want your hands as high as you can get them because it's just more aero. High hands are faster, and you know what? It's also more comfortable. So 2 for 1 there, right? That's why everybody's angling their arms. It's just faster and it's more comfortable. And this is really the biggest visible change Wout has made to his position from last year. His hands are much higher than they have been previously. He's got a little more reach. So along those lines, one of the changes last year that really was welcome is the arm pad itself is now allowed to be tilted as much as 30 degrees up from level. It used to be 15, now it's 30. And by the way, you can tilt it 30 degrees down too. I don't know why you ever would, but technically you've got 30 degrees in either direction, whatever. But here you see Wout's arm pad is right at 30 degrees to support his arm, and that gives him great support and comfort. You'll also notice, though, that arm pad is pretty far up his forearm. It's not supporting him down near the elbows, really where we'd prefer it to be. It's moved forward. And that's just a way, again, for us to kind of play with the rules because since he only gets 14 centimeters from the top of the extension to the middle of the arm pad, if you picture that arm pad moving back towards his elbow, that extension would now be, far more than 14 centimeters. So we move that forward as far as the regulations allow, and in so doing, that gives you more arm angle, and that usually decreases aerodynamic drag the more angle we get. Now, the UCI does limit this. You have to keep the front of your arm pad at least at 18 centimeters from the tip of the extension, so we can't go too far forward. Another thing I would note here, though, very important, is his head position. Getting your head out of the wind is one of the easiest ways to significantly lower your drag. And you look here, his head is dropped very nicely between his shoulders, and there's just no gap between the back of or the underside of his helmet and his back. Now, every triathlete at every level should be making position adjustments to help get their head out of the wind. But they need to do it naturally. As a triathlete, forcing your head lower is just not sustainable over the length of most of your events. But changes can be made to help you naturally lower your head while remaining very comfortable. So we can get that position to make that be very natural for you. And we're going to do a separate video on this very soon. All in all, though, I think this is a much improved position for Wout. I suspect he'll tweak it a little bit, and then we'll see some custom armrests and extensions placed on his on this particular bike. And actually, none of the team have anything custom quite yet, which is normal for early in the year. They want to get their positions dialed in, make the last few tweaks, and then they'll make custom extensions for everyone. This, by the way, is why I do not like custom extensions for amateurs. Once they're made, there's very little, if any, adjustment that can be made for you. So for the average athlete, well, I certainly encourage full arm support. I do not encourage going full custom. There are other designs out there that are modular, that allow for adjustment after purchase. This is a much smarter way to go than a full custom setup. So now let's take a look at the bike. The changes in some ways are very subtle, but there's a significant change, at least on the front end, that I see. Basically, that front bayonet or nose cone area on the new P5 looks like it's kind of been smashed in a bit, as it's clearly shallower than the previous iteration, or the current iteration. There's also more room between the frame and the front wheel for airflow around the top of the tire and on the side of the wheel. This, of course, we've seen quite a bit lately in bikes, and really, this is the most subtle change in a time trial bike we've seen. Other bike designs have gone really wide at both the fork and the seat stays. Cervelo's change seems to be more of a nod to the wider wheels and tires that are now being used on bikes, more than a complete change of how airflow runs through the forks. Down there at the bottom of the fork, the through axle area seems to be cleaned up a bit for cleaner airflow. And though it may just be the photos, it does appear that the front tire is separated from the down tube more than the current bike. We'll talk about that in a second. Moving back, the bottom of the top tube seems to be a bit straighter, and then at least straighter in the current model. And then the junction between the top tube, and seat stays does seem to have more surface area than before. Subtle. It also appears that, like the front wheel, the rear wheel is now separated from the frame, as there's a gap between the seat tube and rear tire, at least more than there used to be. It's not significant. And again, I wonder if it's just a nod to all the different tire sizes being used on bikes these days, perhaps an attempt to leave room for more choices. If it were strictly for aero purposes, I really don't see how these changes would make any significant difference in aerodynamics. I certainly could be wrong. The gaps in these areas, by the way, have gone back and forth from no gap to bigger gaps over and over again for decades, and I just don't think there's an final answer to any of that yet. It's also worth noting, by the way, that Wout, and I believe most, if not all, of his teammates are on dash saddles this year. Beyond being super light, these saddles, many people find to be quite comfortable in the aero position. So that's about it from what we can see thus far. For those of you who already have a P5, it certainly wouldn't appear that these changes are worth going out and purchasing a new bike, right? I doubt there's a massive drop and drag here. The changes are subtle. It's an evolution, not a revolution. And I know some of you may be disappointed. You are hoping for a more significant design change, but keep in mind, this is already one of the fastest, most aero bikes in the world, so it's difficult to improve on something that was already so good. Now, what remains to be seen is whether or not Cervelo has developed add-ons for the P5 for like hydration, nutrition, and tool storage. That would be nice, giving most buyers of this bike use it for triathlon. Are you listening, Cervelo? Hint, hint. Okay, so that's it for today. We have some fun videos coming up for you. The next one's going to be a video about what could be the most aero person in the world, but also a lesson on what that would even mean, and just what is CDA and how do you define it. So that'll be fun, and then we have some really great videos coming up for you. We're going to test some products, obviously, and show you the results to that. We're gonna do some tests in the next month when it comes to drafting the 12 meters and 20 meters for your triathletes, and just how much does that lower drag. So we'll have that data for you soon as well. So if you haven't subscribed to this channel, we're back to making videos. So like this video, subscribe to it, and we're gonna have a lot of fun in 2024. We got a lot of surprises coming up for you. So stay tuned. Okay, we'll see you later.